All right, I want to welcome you all to the 2022 Music City Multicon. This is our first panel discussion. This is Friday afternoon, and we are blessed and privileged to have Mr. Warren Davis sitting in with us here this evening. Hey, Warren, thank you so much for taking the time and spending it with us.
My pleasure.
Yes.
Happy to be here.
Excellent. And the title for this session is called Qbert and Beyond. So certainly appreciate you all setting your time aside here instead of playing the games and working on pinball machines and walking the vendor tables and everything like that to sit and talk with Warren and myself. It's greatly appreciated. So even with the title, we will definitely talk about Qbert quite a bit, but the Beyond part personally is the part that interests me just as much as Qbert. So we're going to save some time towards the end and talk a bit about your career over and above Qbert. I think is probably due.
Sure, whatever you ask, and I will answer. I am an open book.
Appreciate that. So for everybody who may not know me, my name is Whitney Roberts. I'm co-host of the Broken Token Classic Gaming Podcast. And David Corrigan, the show organizer, offered this opportunity to me, and he said, "Hey, Whitney, do you want to run some of these panels?" And I was like, "If I get to talk to people like Warren and David Crane and Gary and Dan Kitchen from Activision," he's like, "Yes, you can count me in." So this to me is awesome. It's a bit of a dream fulfilled from an arcade hobbyist perspective. So with that, Warren, we'll go ahead and get started. With the title of the session being Qbert and Beyond, I mean, I know that you get so much recognition and time around your contributions to the arcade and the gaming world for Qbert. Would you mind to start off a little bit and kind of talk us up to Qbert? And I know that you worked with Jeff Lee from a graphics and an artistic perspective. He was a very prolific artist and graphic designer, worked on a lot of other games beside Qbert as well. But can you give us an idea as far as what led you into this career and then led you to Gottlieb, before Qbert was even on the drawing board?
Right. Well, I was exposed to video games in 1973, which is also my freshman year at college. This is when the first arcade video games came out, and I was a computer engineering student, so I was stunned at this new technology. The idea of a TV screen that you actually could interact with was a revolutionary concept, and not one I had really been experienced to see before. So, and I was learning computers and computer engineering, and I just thought, wow, that would be a fantastic job to be able to do that. But I never really thought it was possible. I thought you had to be somebody special, or you had to know people, and I just didn't know how you would get a job like that. And anyway, I went through my education, and I was headed towards getting a master's degree. I dropped out, ended up taking a year off, and then going to Ohio State to get a master's degree. And I actually got a job with Bell Labs, and they were the ones who sent me to get my master's degree. Okay. So I'm working for Bell Labs, and I moved to suburban Illinois outside Chicago. And I worked for Bell Labs for about 3 years. And I kind of got a little disillusioned with the engineering world. I was introduced to Second City in Chicago. Even though I was living in the suburbs, I'd go into the city a lot, often. And I'm a city guy. I grew up in New York City, so the city of Chicago. I lived in the suburbs, and everybody that was around me was like, "Don't go into Chicago. You'll get murdered. It's a city where people get murdered." So anyway, I ended up going into Chicago almost every weekend, and loved the city. Found the city to be absolutely beautiful. Eventually, again, disillusioned with Bell Labs, and I quit my job and I moved into Chicago. And I started taking improv classes because my thought was I will be an improviser. I didn't really want to be an actor, but I thought improvising, that I could do. And so I studied. I was studying at a place called Players Workshop of Second City, having a really good time. But I had a bunch of odd jobs to kind of pay the rent. I had some savings from Bell Labs, but that started to dwindle, and then I started to think I might need a job. Yeah. So I just looked in the Sunday paper, and I was looking in the Sunday paper one day, and I saw an ad for video game programmers. And I just thought, oh, it can't be
Man.
that easy.
Yeah, back in
And-
the day when you could actually find that way.
Yeah.
That's just amazing.
That's what people did. They
Yeah.
looked in the Sunday classified ads. So
Yeah.
I applied, and it was Gottlieb, and I got the job. And then, like 2-3 weeks later, I'm literally starting a job making video games.
So that's almost. I mean, it's almost crazy to think that you go from looking for work to the Sunday classifieds to walking into Gottlieb, and you're there. I mean, you literally just walked in there and
Yeah.
you're there. So out of curiosity, how difficult was it to get on at Gottlieb? I mean, was this a point in time where they were looking for raw talent and they were trying to scoop people up as fast as they could to capitalize on the market, or how did that work?
So keep in mind that at this time, Gottlieb was a very small video division, very small.
Yeah.
They had only started their video division maybe a year earlier.
Okay.
So I started in January of '82. They really didn't have a lot of people, maybe four, I want to say 4, maybe 5 programmers.
Oh, wow.
I think
Okay.
Jeff Lee was the only artist. Hello, welcome.
Yeah. Hey, thank you.
Jeff Lee was the only artist. They had maybe a couple of sound guys. It was a very small department. And
Okay.
it was still an experiment. They had never released a game.
Yeah.
Tim Skelly, who was the rock star, the guru who was hired because he knew what he was doing. He had a track record.
Yeah.
He was hired, and he was working on Reactor,
Mm-hmm.
which became Gottlieb's first in-house produced game. And when I started, that hadn't been released yet.
Okay.
So it was a very young department, and they were looking for people. They really weren't looking to staff up. In fact, I don't think anybody was hired after me
Okay.
for a while.
Okay.
The department stayed small.
Okay.
A few months after I was hired, when I was kind of in the middle of developing Qbert, we were sort of shunted back over to the main plant.
Yeah.
We were in literally a separate location. We were
Stick
like
you
a
off
little-
to the side where the pinballs are being made.
Well, the thing is, they didn't want us near where the pinballs were being made initially. So the video department was in a completely separate building 8 miles away from the pinball plant.
I see. Okay.
They and the pinball guys weren't so happy about that because they wanted a shot at making video games, but the management wouldn't let them. But 2 guys ran the department. It was Howie Rubin, who was the VP of Business Development, and Ron Waxman was the VP of Engineering. And those guys, I credit them with creating the environment that allowed me to do Qbert, allowed other people to do their games. They were great guys. Ron is no longer with us. Howie is. And Howie's a character, Howie would, make us stop working in the middle of the day and say, all right, everybody, we're going down to the plant. We're going to throw the football around. And we're like, Howie, we want to work. No, come on. We're going to throw the football. And it was just it was an amazing environment, very loose environment.
So the culture was good is really how I hear that.
Oh, yeah. And the thing is, so when I started, I didn't really know much about making video games. I never had.
Okay.
And they assigned me to help out this other programmer, Tom Malinowski, who was working on a game that was a superhero game. Originally supposed to be Superman, but they didn't get the rights because they were expensive. So just some generic superhero.
Yeah.
But the game was kind of based loosely on the Superman 2 movie, where Superman fought 3 villains from Krypton that had the same powers as he did. Anyway, this game went by many names. It was called Protector, Video Man, Guardian, and Argus.
Argus. I played it as Argus, and there is a working Argus machine at Galloping Ghost.
That is correct.
Right outside of Chicago.
Yes.
That's where I've played it, and with a friend of mine, Mike Vinicor, and we've, I think we've played probably the only working one that he knows of, and he's always told me that's his favorite Gottlieb game of all time.
Yeah, he's told me that too. I know, Mike.
Yeah.
But so Jeff Lee, the artist, and Tom Malinowski, the designer programmer, they restored it. They found ROMs, and with the Doc Mac's help, they restored it, and now it is Argus and it is playable. But for some reason, back when it was made in the early part of 1982, did not collect well. It went out on test. They kept changing things. It had a trackball, it had a joystick, it had this, it had
would
that.
work really good trackball. I mean, that just for how chaotic the character movement is, and how you have to keep him moving all the time in all different directions.
Yeah.
Trackball's good for that. Yeah.
Well, my role in it was fairly small. So Tom had this thing where the superhero would smash into the side of a building, and he wanted rubble to fall down.
Okay.
So there were these little pieces of rubble that would fall down. Without gravity, mind you, at a constant rate. You know?
Yeah.
Gravity at the time was too advanced for me.
Yeah. Yep.
But so I programmed the rubble, and then I programmed a bulldozer to come from the side of the screen periodically and push the rubble away because it would just accumulate. I mean, I don't know why we didn't just wink it off, but we didn't. We had a bulldozer.
Yeah.
So that was me. So that's literally all I really did, and I think I might have worked on the diagnostics package for that as well. But you know, I worked on that for a little while. When that game was scrapped, then basically Howie and Ron came to me and said, "All right, well, Warren, it's your turn. Make a game."
So when they come to you and say, "Make a game," I mean, how? And you're relatively new to the organization. This is your first time through. I mean, there's got to be some anxiety about, okay, what am I going to do next? And how does that request to make a game turn into Qbert? Because I'm really curious, and I'm sure for everybody here in the audience, you've seen Qbert, you know Qbert. I mean, it's essentially a cultural icon at this point. There's been Saturday morning cartoons. There's been Qbert ported to 10, 15 different systems over the past 15, 20 years. But where did it start?
Okay, well, it started as a programming exercise.
Okay.
I did not start, they said make a game. And I was like, well, okay, but there's things I want to teach myself. I didn't feel like I was ready.
Okay.
There were things I wanted to learn. And just by happenstance, I was walking through, we had a big open room where all the programmers worked. And we only had 3 at the time workstations between us that we shared. So, somebody, 1 or 2 people couldn't get on because there were only 3 machines.
Okay.
And so Kan Yamamoto is one of our programmers who's best known nowadays for Mad Planets, which was one of Gottlieb's games. I think it was
one of my absolute favorites.
Yes, Mad Planets gets a lot of love these days.
Well, rightfully so. Well deserved.
And that was Kan's game. But Kan was just playing around with an idea because our hardware allowed you to swap background and foreground. So, he had an image. He had images in the foreground, sprites moving around. But for his background, he used the cubes filling the screen, which Jeff Lee had provided for him.
Okay.
Now, the cubes were literally 6 background blocks that repeated. And when you repeated them and it filled the screen, it just looked like the whole screen was filled with cubes.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just walking by and I saw that and I got very intrigued because I thought to myself, if a ball fell on a cube, it would have one of 2 ways to bounce down.
Right.
It could either bounce down to the left or down to the right. And that was intriguing to me. And I thought, so if you carved this into a pyramid and balls started falling on the top cube with 8 levels, let's say you had 8 rows of cubes, a random byte, which is 8 random bits, and every bit is right or left as opposed to 0 or 1, you could determine the path of a ball. And so I said, okay, that seems like a cool exercise.
Okay.
I'm just going to do that.
Okay.
So, because I had to learn not only gravity, how to
simulate gravity, yes.
but also the bouncing. How does it? I have to do collision detection when it lands. I have to reverse it and bounce it. So that's what I did. That's all I did. That was all I tried to do.
Okay.
I had a pyramid of cubes and a ball bouncing, which I got the artwork from Jeff. Ball bouncing down from the top, and I got a random number generator made, and that was it. So I had balls bouncing down, and of course they hit the bottom and they go just fall off to infinity.
Into the ether, yes.
And people would say, wow, that looks pretty cool. You should do something with that. I thought, okay, well, I don't know. All right, sure. I guess I could have a player character jumping around on the pyramid.
Okay.
Okay, sure. So I went to Jeff, and I said, do you have any characters that you're not really using at the moment? And he's like, yeah. And he put a bunch up on the screen, and I remember he had them lined up, and this orange guy with the big nose, I thought, he looks kind of pathetic. That'd be good. That'd be a good one.
Poor Qbert.
So
we love him so much, though.
Yeah, so he made me all the angles I needed. And,
okay.
he made me a little little frame where he's got a little bounce in his knee as he
Mhm.
lands and stuff. And I went about doing that. Just
That's
you know,
something I want to come back to in a
Sure.
second, though. Actually, just the attention to detail on the
Mhm.
character animation. But
Yeah.
yeah.
But
keep
anyway,
going.
I mean, that's essentially the story because
Yeah.
it literally just happened one step at a time after that.
Okay.
I had no game plan. I never had a game design. Every time I put something in, I would think, what should I do next?
Okay.
And sometimes people would suggest things, and sometimes they'd be great.
Yeah.
And a lot of times people would suggest things, and I would say no. Like, for example, the nose. Let's talk
Mhm.
about his nose. So Jeff
Yes.
designed him to shoot out of his nose. Well, I was like, oh, that ain't not going to happen.
Yeah.
Because I was way too complicated.
Uh-huh.
I didn't want to make a complicated game. I was not a fan of like crazy complicated games. Like Defender was way out of my
Oh
league.
my gosh! Yeah,
Um,
yes, Defender, but it's a great game. But
Oh, yeah, it's a fantastic
but it
game.
requires total concentration.
Sure.
Yes.
I mean, it's a fantastic game for somebody else.
Yeah, fair
not
enough.
me.
Okay, fair enough.
But I did like Robotron. But
Yes.
even that, that was
That's-
challenging
That's
to me.
a great game as well.
And I
Yes.
thought, oh, I kind of want to make a simple game. I want to make a game where you can play it with one hand.
Yep.
You can hold a drink in your other hand.
Yeah.
That to me was ideal.
Yes.
So the shooting was out.
Okay.
But again, it just progressed that way. I mean, I wrote all of the code. I was the only programmer. Tim Skelly helped me.
Mhm.
He recommended a random number technique
Yeah.
for me and things like that. Jeff was a very important collaborator, throwing out tons of ideas, many of which I used. Dave Thiel, our sound guy,
Yes.
also really important. So when the game was done, I felt like the three of us formed the Qbert triumvirate. I mean,
Yeah.
other people had made suggestions that made it in the game, but really these are the guys I relied on, and I felt we were the team. So I always call us the Qbert triumvirate.
Okay, but then it's awesome to hear you give those gentlemen their just due, because part of I think what has endeared Qbert to me over time, having had the arcade cabinet for years and years now and played it for as long as I have, it's the attention to detail, and it comes through in how Qbert moves, how he lands, how coily compresses and
Mhm.
stretches as he moves around the cubes,
Mhm.
how the characters just kind of rotate and amble and just kind of go about their own little way in this universe on the pyramid. And I really appreciate that level of attention to
Mm.
detail. And I just always thought that it makes for such a quality game, because not taking anything away from Pac-Man or anything like that, but Pac-Man only goes in 4 directions, and you just don't really see a lot of advanced art, advanced character work done there. But Qbert, there is. I mean, you can
Yeah.
almost see his fur, or you think you see his fur. It's neat.
Well, that's Jeff. Jeff did all the characters.
Yeah.
I think things like the bounce in the knee, I think I might have requested that.
Yeah.
I know I requested the same thing for the ball.
Uh-huh.
Like when the ball lands, it's just a little slight image of a squish.
Yeah, like a little compression
Yeah,
there.
yeah. Just trying to make it real. It just I have to say, a lot of the stuff that you're talking about just seemed obvious to me. It was
Yeah.
it didn't seem like it was like any major, stroke of genius. It was
Yeah.
like, oh, he's landing. His knees should compress a little bit.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm glad you appreciate it. I'm glad other people do too. Obviously,
I think just the character animation, just the way it moves, and just how, I'm just going to go ahead and say just how cute the overall game is. It makes it endearing, and it's created a legacy in and of itself where it stands on its own, and that's the thing that I just think is so neat about it, I guess, is the best way to say
total
that.
accident.
Yeah, exactly. So on the sounds for Qbert,
Mhm.
that is equally as impressive and contributes to the gameplay as much as anything else. So you mentioned Dave Thiel. Can you talk a little bit about collaboration with him? Would you go to Dave and say, Dave, I need the coily to sound like whatever coily sounds like, however you describe that sound.
Uh-huh.
Did you tell him what you wanted, or would he look at the game and say, Warren, I got you covered. Give me 3 days. I'm going to come back and we've got this all knocked out. I mean, how did that go?
Well, the answer is both of those things.
Okay.
So if I had an idea if I knew like I wanted this, I would go to Dave and say, give me this. Like, for example, when Cubert jumps off, I knew I wanted something that went,
Oh, yes.
and I could demonstrate that, and Dave could make that.
Okay.
But then when it comes to his speech, that was all Dave. So I didn't have any particular idea about how he should speak. But Dave, seeing the character, seeing the cartoon balloons, and oh man, I got a great idea for this. And because it was my first game, I mean, I was not such a prima donna that I was like, oh, I know everything.
Yeah.
No, I really counted on these guys to be their most creative, and they were. They were just lucky.
No, well, so you talk about Cubert falling off the pyramid. We look at Coily as he falls off the pyramid and everything like that when Cubert hops on the disc and he chases him off. Whose idea was it for the knocker in the cabinet, and how did that get integrated? Because I don't know, knowing what I know on Gottlieb arcade history, I don't recall there being another Gottlieb arcade game that used the knocker. So
actually, there were many. They were all pinball machines.
Exactly. Yeah, that's it. That's it. So how did that knocker wind up in Cubert? What's the story behind that?
So we had an engineering technician. His name was Rick Ty.
Okay.
And one day he just said, hey, because like I said, people gave me ideas all the time.
Yeah.
But one day he said, hey, you know what? You should put a pinball knocker in there. And when
so
it
was just that matter of fact.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I thought, that's pretty cool. Now, my thought was to have it sound like I wanted it to be the body.
Yeah.
To sound like the body is falling at the bottom of the cabinet. So we put it in, we were able to send a signal in the software when we wanted it, and set off the knocker. All worked good, except it sounds like a knock, like somebody's knocking at the door.
It does, yeah. It's got that sound almost like you're just going against plywood. Well, you are going against plywood, but yeah, it sounds that way.
So I did not want that. I was like, oh, well, yeah, it's not exactly right. I want a thud. So we started experimenting. We came up with a bunch of things. We ended up putting a piece of foam, like at the end of integrated circuit tubes, they came in these long plastic tubes. And at the end of each end would be a little piece of foam. We put that in the cabinet, glued it down or whatever. The piston comes out of the knocker, hits the side of the cabinet, hits the foam, and it softened the sound just enough.
That kind of dead blow sound.
It just sounded like a thud. It sounded like a sack of potatoes being dropped. And I was like, that's so great. That's perfect. So I was very excited about it. And we went to management at that point and said, hey, we got this great feature. This is amazing. And management was like, well, it's a cool feature. I mean, they probably had tons of pinball knockers, in surplus that they wanted to get rid of.
Oh, yeah. You'd have to think boxes and boxes of them.
So they're like, we could do the knocker, but the foam, that was a problem.
Why is that a problem?
Well, they had
is it like a bill of material?
Order the foam. They had to get somebody to go in very meticulously and glue the foam in exactly the right spot.
I understand now.
They just said it's going to add the cost of the game, and they said we don't want to go for that. So the knocker was in, the foam was out, and I was disappointed. But people love that feature. I'm not going to say anything bad about it. People love it. That's fantastic.
It is. It's part of what makes.
I recommend people put a piece of foam.
I am going to
where the knocker hits the cabinet.
I'm going to do
play
that.
with it until you get that thud sound.
Yes. I think what I'll wind up doing is if I can't get it spaced exactly right, I'll come up with a way to mount a piece of foam there and 3D print a bracket or something. But I'm gonna take you up on that.
I mean, even better would be replace the knocker with something where that signal will trigger some pre-recorded sample of a body hitting the ground. That would be really cool. Put a little speaker down there. Yeah. That would be awesome.
See, that's what we're really after, right?
Yeah. I want to know if anybody does that. I want to hear about it.
Well, that's cool. I'm definitely going to give it a try at some point. So that's awesome. On the sounds, so Cubert the game makes a lot of really interesting sounds, Warren. It ranges from Cubert getting a knock on the head and cursing, from you're talking about the kind of the I guess the oh no falls off the pyramid, and just the ambling sounds of all the characters on the screen and everything like that. Where did the idea of the cursing and everything like that come from? Because I think it's just cool.
Yeah, the cursing, like I said before, was Dave saying, I know exactly what to do here.
Yeah.
You know, with the cartoon balloon. He was familiar with this. We had a speech chip on our soundboard, and it was used, it would string together human phonemes, English phonemes, which are the parts, the spoken parts of a word. And you could make it say whatever you wanted. And Dave was familiar with this chip, and he had used it in pinball machines, say things like bonus and things like that. But he didn't like it, and the sound was terrible. It was very monotone and robotic. And so this was a fantastic opportunity. He just said, I'm going to throw random numbers at this thing. So it's really, he's just saying random phonemes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's no predetermined sound that will be made. Does it change from game to game and pieces and parts inside the game, or how does that work?
Well, it's, you know, there's a random seed that starts any random number generator, and then as the game progresses, so many things are calling for random numbers. The likelihood of anything being duplicated is
very minimal.
Impossible. Yeah. So yeah, he's just using whatever random pseudo random number his random number generator gives him next.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. Just to think about how all of that came together, and then it creates little bits and pieces of what the totality of the game actually is.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's neat. How long did you work on Q*bert from start to finish from a development standpoint?
I started around I say March or April of 1982.
Okay.
And I'd say by August, we were getting ready to put it out on test. So I think it was pretty solid. Took, I'd say, about 5 months.
Okay.
And then we started testing. So we had already done sort of in-house testing. The next thing we would do is take it out to coin tests in arcades, let people play it. We did focus groups where we would, you know, bring people into a little room with a one-way mirror and have them play it, and then ask them questions about it and observe them. And we had all these things, and then I kept tuning it, and of course it was my first game, so I didn't know anything about tuning other than, you know, trying to make people like it.
Yeah.
But it seemed people were frustrated by it, and they had a hard time, so I would make it easier, and management was always encouraging me to make it easier, and so I kept slowing it down, making it easier. But even so, like, I couldn't envision anybody playing beyond level 5. I could not play past level 5, and I probably couldn't play past level 4. I just thought it got impossible.
Okay.
And apparently I was wrong.
Yeah, because people, I mean, I've seen some folks that marathon it for days.
Yeah.
And I personally could not even ever hope to come close to doing that. But that's impressive.
I'm impressed. That level of gameplay. I'm definitely impressed. Yeah.
Yes.
I wasn't impressed at the time. I was worried because when you hear that people are playing your game for hours and hours on a single quarter, that is normally not good news.
Not what you
in the arcade industry.
Yes.
But you know, in this case, I've actually come to believe that it helped the game, because if people know that somebody could get that good at it, that inspires them to keep trying.
Yeah.
So I think that actually worked in the game's favor.
Oh, well, that's good. That's good. One of the probably more, I won't say arcane, but lesser known details, I think, around Q*bert is there is an alternate set of ROMs called Faster, Harder, More Challenging.
Yes.
And FHMC. And for folks that may not be in the arcade hobby or anything like that, could you give us, I guess, kind of a download on what Faster, Harder, More Challenging Q*bert is, why you created it, and what led you to release those ROMs when you did, because you did, quote unquote, kind of gift them to the world, so to speak, in that manner. What led up to that?
Well, the why I sort of said, you know, already.
Fair enough.
When I started hearing the game had just been released and we're getting reports of people playing it for a very long time, I started to think, oh man, I blew it. I tuned it too easy. And so I immediately, nobody asked me to, I immediately started working on this sort of souped up version where I was restoring it back to, you know, where it was faster. And then, you know, again, I brought Jeff. Jeff was involved. Dave Thiel at that time, I believe, was gone from the company.
Okay.
I don't think he was there anymore, but we didn't change any sounds. But we did add a character, Q*bertha,
Q*bertha,
who's sort of like a pseudo coily, chasing after Q*bert. And then, you know, I totally jiggled around the levels and the way the levels get harder to make it get harder faster.
Right.
Yeah, and I just kept tuning it to the point where I felt like, okay, I like it.
Yeah.
It's fast. It starts fast out of the gate. It's challenging. It became my Q*bert of choice.
Yeah.
Well, we tested it like way too soon. People were still learning and getting to know the original Q*bert. I was thinking, okay, because it didn't take long to make.
Yeah.
But I was thinking, we can wait a year, and then release it.
Yeah, and kind of revive the game all over again. Yeah.
Well, management didn't do that. They put it out on test immediately, and it didn't test well. And they said, yeah, we're gonna scrap it. So I was the only one who had the ROMs. Mm-hmm. I had the ROMs I had a Q*bert at home, which was an engineering sample that I had gotten, one of the original engineering samples, and I put those ROMs in there, and my Q*bert at home had those ROMs for years.
Okay.
About 15 years. And then in the late 90s, mid to late 90s, I was working for Disney Interactive, and the MAME project had come out where they had put emulators that you could run on your PC. So I had seen the Q*bert emulator. So they were emulating Gottlieb's hardware perfectly.
Yeah.
And FHMC Q*bert was just a ROM swap.
Yeah.
So I thought, oh, well, if I put different ROM images into this emulator, it should play faster, harder, more challenging Q*bert.
And lo and behold.
And it does.
Yeah.
So I happened to know somebody at Disney who knew the guys who were doing MAME.
Okay.
So I went, he told me that. He said, he's probably the guy who turned me on to MAME in the first place.
Okay.
And I said, tell these guys, I have a version of Q*bert that, has only existed in my cabinet at home for the last 15 years.
Unbelievable.
Would they be interested in, releasing it or whatever? So the interesting thing about the MAME project was they were not legally allowed to distribute ROM images.
That is correct, yes.
They released the emulators, and you had to get your ROM images somewhere else.
Yes, correct.
So I gave the ROM images to my buddy Fred from Disney, and he gave the ROM images to whoever posts ROM images somewhere. And for a while, I guess I was a little worried maybe that Sony, who owned the rights to Q*bert, I never owned the rights, I was a little worried they might come after me, but they never did. So 1997 or so, faster, harder, more challenging Q*bert was unleashed on the world, and the world has only gone downhill since.
So,
my fault.
No, that's funny. So I'm curious. There was I guess a sequel to Q*bert called Q*bert's Cubes.
Yeah.
Has anybody heard of Q*bert's Cubes? Okay, all right. We have one. Okay, a couple of folks. Okay, good deal. So could you talk a little bit about any involvement, if any, around Q*bert's Cubes and really how that kind of came to be, because it is a diametrically opposed. It's different than Q*bert in so many ways.
Sure. I mean, I had nothing to do with it. After Q*bert and faster, harder, more challenging Q*bert, management came to me and said, look, do you want to do another Q*bert game? And I said, no, I just wasn't interested. I mean, Q*bert was my first game.
Yeah.
I had so many ideas I wanted to pursue. I didn't want to be stuck in that, and I felt I had done it.
Yeah.
And then a guy named Neil Bernstein, who was kind of a junior programmer, recent hire, came up to me and said, hey, I've got an idea for a Q*bert game. Do you mind if I pursue it? And I said, no, have at it. So it was all him. I think Jeff did helped him with the artwork. Jeff was pretty much the only artist at the company. I mean, we had programmers who were artists, but if a programmer wasn't, I'm pretty sure it was Jeff Lee who did their artwork.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, but that's how Q*bert's Cubes came to be. I really didn't have anything to do with it.
It's an interesting game because it's the character, and then it's just turned completely on its head from a game mechanic perspective. To me, it's weird because it's really only Q*bert by name and by character, but by gameplay and just structure and how it flows, it's not.
Yeah. Well, Q*bert's jumping.
Yeah.
From one cube to another.
Yeah.
So you got to give it that.
I have to give it that. Yeah. But just the way it's organized is just different.
Yeah. I mean, I find it really challenging. Although
Yes.
I played it recently, And I thought, oh, this is kind of cool.
I mean, coming back to it, do you think it's aged? Do you think it's aged as well as Q*bert has aged? Because it's just what I mean. Q*bert's Cubes just was not a very popular game, I guess, at the time that it came out.
Yeah, I'm not sure why. Honestly, I don't. Maybe it was too frustrating. I mean, I think one of the things about Q*bert that I'm coming to understand is people found it frustrating. Like I do these shows and I have a table and people come up and talk to me and like maybe not 90%. A lot of the time people say, that game frustrated me. But they kept playing it. They still love it. So it was that fine line of being frustrating, but not so frustrating that you didn't enjoy playing.
That's exactly right.
And it could very well be that Q*bert's Cubes wasn't quite, they were a little over the line in some way.
I think that's a good way to say it. It was a little over the line. It just did not have that I don't know, that 7 or 8 second appeal to it that Q*bert does. And another game that has that level of appeal is like Donkey Kong. It's so challenging. And I've often heard that Donkey Kong was developed and programmed in such a way that the average game or the average life in that game should only last 7 to 8 seconds. And but it wants you to come back and play again and again and again. And Q*bert's much the same way. So so the character's been used in pop culture for decades now. How much involvement do you have in that? Do you ever get consulted? Do you ever have input on like Q*bert and Wreck-It Ralph? I mean, I'm sure everybody's seen Wreck-It Ralph, right? And so you see Q*bert and Wreck-It Ralph, and it's just like, oh my gosh, he's so cute, But it's like, how does Q*bert wind up there? And it's just neat, I guess, to hear how maybe you might have what your thoughts are and if you've involved in any of that.
So, first part of the question,
yeah.
No.
Man, that's a shame.
I have no involvement whatsoever.
That's a shame. Yeah.
I am not. All I have when it comes to Q*bert is bragging rights. I don't own the character.
Yeah.
I don't make money from the character. I don't make money from licensing or merchandising. I never did.
Yeah.
It's when you work for any company as an engineer, you basically sign a piece of paper that says everything you do is owned by the company. You know what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So and listen, I have no bitterness about it. To be honest, I was very lucky to be able to have the opportunity to make these games. So I'm not bitter about it. I have to say though, there was a time where Gottlieb came up with a royalty program.
Okay.
And this was after Mach 3. So it was Q*bert, Mad Planets, I think Mach 3. And Mach 3 was a huge success, Laserdisc game.
Yeah.
And then when Mach 3 was over, they decided, okay, we should have a royalty program. So they instituted a royalty program, which means that based on the number of machines they build, you're going to get some kind of bonuses, more than a bonus, a royalty.
Yeah.
I guess a bonus was sort of just some number that they decide they can give you some money, whereas a royalty, there's a
it's
formula.
Ongoing. It's ongoing.
It's a formula that's computed.
Yeah.
And anyway, they announced this. They said, okay, so if Warren, and they used me as an example. They said, so for example, if Warren had been making Q*bert under this royalty program, he would made about like $110,000 in royalties. But I didn't because it was not retroactive.
Yeah,
so,
that's
but it was
harsh.
nice of them to let me know how much money I would have made if it was.
Oh yeah. Oh, that's super nice, isn't it? Yeah.
So that stung. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah.
But I'm still not bitter.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a great thing to be associated with and to be known for. So we can certainly say that.
The second part of your question is, what do I think of all of this?
Yeah.
So when I first saw, people told me about Wreck-It Ralph, and they said that Q*bert's going to be in this big Disney cartoon, and I thought, oh my God, that's crazy.
Yeah.
And then when I saw it, and I saw that he's portrayed as this sort of like homeless, dejected, forgotten character, I was like, oh my God.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Really? I mean, he gets redeemed at the end and stuff.
Yes, he does.
And then the more I thought about it, I thought, you know what? There's no such thing as bad publicity, right?
There is none.
The fact that he's there, the fact that he's in it, he was in Wreck-It Ralph 2. He was in Pixels.
Yeah.
These are good things. It introduces the character to a new generation. I don't have any problem with that.
Yeah,
it's nice.
That's neat. That's neat. Well, one thing that I did want to ask you before we kind of hop off Q*bert and take some questions for the audience is This is a marquee to a Qbert arcade game, and I'm sure this is something that everybody is probably familiar with from the sense of playing the game and everything like that. So Warren, can you talk a little bit about the art? I'm sure that is this art all Jeff's design and direction, or did you have input on this, or how did that work?
I had no input on it.
Interesting.
I didn't really care about it. I mean, I'm not an artist, so when it comes to doing marquee for a video game, and I've never made a video game in my life, I'm like, let the professionals do it.
Okay.
That's what their job is. Now, in this case, we had a couple of cabinet artists. Terry Dorzaf was one of them. Larry Day was another, and I'm honestly not sure who did the art. I think it was Terry Dorzaf, quite honestly, but I'm not 100% sure. I don't even think Jeff remembers. We were just talking about this. But it would have been one of those guys, yeah. Jeff didn't do these graphics. He did the video graphics.
Yeah, understood. I was just curious if he or you had any input into this and really how the total picture of the cabinet came to be, I guess, is really what I'm asking.
I do remember having some input on the design of the cabinet, because we had a sort of a generic cabinet, and then they were sort of tuning it to be what they wanted. Reactor had a different cabinet. We were talking about things like, what's the angle of the back glass? What's the angle of the control panel? Do you want it completely flat? Well, then people put their drinks on it, and you don't want that. So it's a little bit of an angle. The back glass, if it's tilted back, you get a glare. If you tilt it forward, maybe. Anyway, we talked about all of these things, and it was a compromise. I had my input. I had no say. I couldn't put my foot down. But again, I'm not a cabinet designer either. I just have opinions, and that's it. I mean, it ended up being whatever it was.
Yeah, no, that's interesting, because I don't know if folks have seen this before or not, but this is a what would be considered, or what's called, the swear marquee for Qbert. Much rarer.
What's that sticker on his head?
That is actually a Kentucky State tax sticker.
Not original.
No, this is not original. So this marquee was taken from an earning game in the state of Kentucky, but you don't see this marquee very often at all in the collector circles.
Really?
It's regarded to be much rarer. And I was kind of curious. Is there anything you can tell us or tell me about the history on this, and why did Gottlieb do two? And whose decision would it have been to do two? And
well, they didn't really do two. They did one, but they did one at a time. So
fair enough.
So, but when the game was to go out on test, it didn't have a name. All the time I was developing it, it wasn't called Qbert. It was called the Cubes game. None of the characters had names. I was just trying to make a game. Naming the characters was a burden I did not want added to my plate.
That is so interesting.
So, but then when the game came time to be released, then we had to come up with a name. But in the meantime, for testing and things like that, Howie Rubin, our VP of Business Development, I told you he's an out-of-the-box kind of a thinker. He's like, we should just call the game the swearing balloon. And we were all like, what? He's like, yeah.
Balloon.
We should just call it the blah, 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 blah. Well, Howie, how are people going to talk about it? Yeah. How are people going to refer to it if they want to talk about it?
If this is all they have.
Yeah. And he's like, they'll find a way. If the game is as good as I think it is, they'll find a way. And maybe he's right. Maybe they would have. I don't know. But the game went out on test. That's why we had those produced. My recollections, we have maybe between 12 and 20 produced. And games went out on test with those marquees until we actually came up with a real name. And
then that's when we got the Qbert marquee.
Yeah. Right.
Interesting.
Exactly.
Wow. That is neat. Well, you heard it here, everybody. That's the story behind the swear marquee. That's pretty amazing. So Warren, for your time at Gottlieb, can you talk a bit about what you did after Qbert? Because I think it's important to at least have an understanding as to how Qbert shaped your career and your time, your remaining time at Gottlieb. And would you mind to give us a brief lowdown on what's been happening since?
In the 40 years since? Sure.
Plus or minus.
Let's just run by that quickly.
Yeah.
After Qbert and after Faster, Harder, More Challenging Qbert, I started pursuing other ideas. I had, other things had come to me. So I have this memoir. It's a book that I have with me, and I sell it here. It's available online, but it talks about some of the games that I was exploring, some of the ideas I was exploring. And I have some photos of them, some screenshots. Yeah, it was just, I mean, I was definitely interested in this idea of pseudo 3D, adding a depth to the screen. So most of the ideas I explored had that in it. They pretty much came and went. I'd do an idea and then I'd get to a point where I'd be like, it's cool, but I don't know what to do with it now.
Yeah.
And so I'd move on to something else. And there were 3 or 4 things I worked on. One thing I worked on, by the way, which I don't even remember exactly how this came about, but I think it was just that there were, I had lived in apartments that had a lot of flies. And, when I had roommates, we sort of had contests about who'd kill the most flies.
Who could swat the most
flies. And we ended up having a chart up.
Yeah.
Like, and we'd keep score of who killed the most flies. And everybody had a different method. But I thought, it's kind of cool. You never see an actual hand as a controller. So I thought, well, it'd be cool if you're controlling a human hand. And I thought, okay, it's simple. With a joystick, right? You just press a button on top of the joystick and the hand closes. And you let go and it opens. It's so simple. And then the joystick moves it around. So I asked Jeff to make a bunch of flies, like cartoony kind of flies. And, I just had them flying around randomly.
Yeah.
And then I had a hand, a left and a right, so you could have one player against another. And all you had to do is come up behind a fly. And of course, the flies are not staying in one place. That's where the skill came in.
Yeah.
Put your hand up behind a fly, squeeze it, and if you got it, when you opened your hand, a dead fly would just fall, would just plummet straight down. and you'd get score. You'd get a 1 or whatever. And I thought that was fun. And so we had that up in the office. And people would play that all the time. And I thought this was immensely fun. And I was like, there's a game, but management didn't really want to release that. But it sat for months, I think, in the office, and people just played it. But the furthest I got with a real concept that actually was going to be released, or might have been released, was, I shudder to say this, I called it, for lack of a better name, bunny bondage. And why? The original thing I wanted to call it was Ricochet Rabbit, because basically rabbits were flying through the air and bouncing off of things in different directions, and you had to avoid them, and you had a shield, so you had to kind of steer them and guide them with your ricochets. But that was the main control, was bouncing things off a shield. And this was fun too. I really enjoyed it. But again, I got to a point where I was spinning my wheels a little bit, and I wasn't sure what to do with it. And in that moment, when I was spinning my wheels, Dennis Nordman, one of our designers, came up to me and said, Warren, I've got an idea for a Laserdisc game. Would you help me with it? And that turned into Us Versus Them. And, I immediately dropped this game, Bunny Bondage. And I said, okay, I'll come back to it. But after Us Versus Them, I really didn't come back to it. I should have. I feel bad.
So after Us Versus Them, did you find that maybe the time at Gottlieb was starting to grow a little? Was it starting to get a bit long in the tooth, or was Gottlieb still supportive of you and what you wanted to do, or did you find the industry? I mean, the industry moved really fast at that point. And did you feel that maybe finding other publisher game designer, game development houses would be the right thing to do? Or how did that all wind up?
Look, I was a company man. I worked for Gottlieb. They were very good to me. They'd always been good to me, and I had no desire to leave. But what happened was, after Us Versus Them, there's a whole debacle associated with Us Versus Them, because the Laserdisc industry, the bottom fell out of it.
Yeah.
And the Laserdisc arcade game industry, and it was a big crash. There was a huge crash in the industry in about 1984. Plus, there were a lot of other political things going on. Gottlieb was owned by Columbia Pictures, which was owned by Coca-Cola at the time. Coca-Cola, I think they didn't really want to have a pinball company. And like I said, there was a crash, so but Gottlieb had a lot of success with both Qbert and Mach 3, and it looked like Us Versus Them was going to be a huge success. But the culture at Gottlieb started to change afterwards. When times started to change, what had happened is they had grown the department. So there were, instead of like 4 or 5 programmers, there were like 12 programmers. And again, Gottlieb gave them total freedom to do whatever they wanted. Unfortunately, not everybody thrived in that environment. Some people, a lot of people were spinning their wheels, spending way, way too much time on a game. And without any oversight, it just went on. And they had, the thing is, they're a manufacturing plant.
Yes.
They need to be making games. They need to keep that production line rolling.
Right.
And every time a game came out, they're like, what's the next game? So they were faced with the possibility that there's no game coming up next. So they hired a middle manager guy. His name was Bill Adams, and he came from Bally Midway. And he kind of cracked the whip.
Yeah.
So the department had to shape up. And it was a bit of I would say it's a bit of an oppressive environment. Not to take it away from Bill. He had a job to do, and he was doing his job, but it became a less fun place to work. Creativity was no longer valued as much. It was literally just make a game that we can sell.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was it got to be different, but ultimately it didn't matter because the company was shut down in the fall of 1984.
Well, how's your involvement in the industry, I guess, kind of carried the years for you since Gottlieb?
Wow, I'm not sure how to answer that question.
It's a big question, I'm sure.
Say it again in a different way.
Sure. So after Gottlieb, where have you found yourself in the sense of
unemployed
with the industry, in the industry, out of the industry? How's that gone?
Sure. Well, I mean, after Gottlieb, I was unemployed. I found a job almost immediately out of the industry, out of the video game industry. But I was happy. I thought, hey, I had a good run. Yeah. That was pretty good. So I was out of the industry for 1.5 years, and then I got a phone call from a headhunter saying, how would you like to make video games again? And I said, yeah. Well, that guy was working for Williams. So the crash had happened, the slump had happened, their video department was decimated, and then they were starting to build up again. I guess enough time had passed that the industry was starting to come back. They were investing in people, and they asked me to come and play with them, and I did. I said yes. Yeah. So I started at Williams in like 1986, and I was there for, again, about 1.5 years. And during that time, I started playing. I worked on Joust 2. I started playing with digitizers, which were a new thing, and that was very exciting to me personally, this idea that we could have digitized video graphics in our games and not these cartoon graphics. And so we were working on a 256 color system, and 256 colors compared to 16 is a lot, and it gives you a lot of opportunity to have sort of pseudo photographic quality, and that's what I was working on. So I was very excited about that work, and once we had our hardware, I created some tools to make digitized graphics possible, and then that system ended up becoming NARC, if you know of NARC. The system was developed sort of by Mark Lafredo was the hardware guy. Eugene Jarvis was involved in it, heavily in its design. I wrote the display system. Eugene wrote the operating system. And then we kind of split off, and Eugene led the NARC team, and I and John Newcomer, creator of Joust, worked on another game, and that game never got released. And shortly after that game was canceled, I left Williams. They wanted me to work on a football game. I really wasn't interested in football games. Yeah. So I left, just crazy coincidence, but right at that time I was contacted by Premier Electronics. Premier Electronics was basically the remnants of old Gottlieb. Gottlieb was canned, but the pinball VP bought the rights to continue making pinball machines under the Gottlieb name. He started this company, Premier Technologies. And all of a sudden, at that exact moment that I left Williams, they decided they want to get into video games. So they hired me, some other old Gottlieb employees, to basically design and create a new video game system. And we did. And then we did a game which was called Exterminator. So that game is a whole nother story. We don't have time for it,
we don't have time for it, unfortunately.
And then after that, the question was, am I going to do another game for Premiere? And the answer was no. That was Premiere's answer. And so, again, just coincidentally, Williams called me and said, you know what? We just had a guy leave in the middle of a game, and we need somebody who knows the hardware. Can you come back? And I was like, yeah. And that game turned out to be Terminator 2. So I came back into work at Terminator 2, and that was a fantastic experience. The game did really well. I was able to continue working and improving my digitizing system. And then that team pretty much stayed together for Revolution X. And that was the next game we made. And then I left the arcade industry, and that's another long story we just don't have time to get into.
Well, I appreciate that, though, Warren, because you took us through essentially from the beginning of Qbert throughout your entire involvement in the video game industry, and we did it in 55 minutes. So that's pretty good. So we've got just a few minutes left for Q&A. Does anybody have any questions for Warren or anything that we've covered here tonight? Yes, sir.
So you just talked about Terminator 2 Revolution X. What was the thought process between like using a potentiometer for the gun as opposed to doing like a traditional light gun at that point?
I could not tell you that. That wasn't my decision. That was a decision that was made before I came on board. Like I said, I replaced a programmer who had quit in the middle, but that decision had already been made. I really don't know what the design criteria were for those guns. They worked really well. Yeah. And once we had them, we just stuck with them.
Yes, a winning formula, I guess, from that regard. So
yeah, something works.
Yeah. Anybody else? Any questions? Okay. Yep. Go ahead.
So you sound like you're like using kind of like non-traditional arcade elements, like not just the controls, like you have like the pinball thumper and things like that. Are there any type of new electronic upgrades that have been since like more modern now that you would want to make an arcade game like around? Like some sort of odd element to put in an arcade cabinet?
Well, virtual reality. I was at the Game Developers Conference earlier this year in San Francisco, and there are a lot of people working on arcade experiences with virtual reality, which I think is phenomenal because they're very immersive. And the problem with a lot of virtual reality is, like, for example, if you're wearing a helmet and you're moving, but your body knows it's not moving, you get motion sickness. So they try to simulate things with wind and heat. There's an amazing thing, like if you're walking past a torch and you feel the heat from that torch, that's pretty cool. It's just very immersive. And I love the idea of that. Yeah, I love virtual reality.
Yes.
Did you have a question?
Yes, I did have a question.
Okay.
So from, I guess you say computer programmer standpoint, what is, I guess, your philosophy for interacting with people who deal primarily with hardware? And what was, I guess, like the most challenging things between programming and then also having to think about a hardware interface with the user? Like, what if you just, like, a computer and decoding, and then also trying to think about how that would transmit to user experience?
I mean, if I'm understanding the question.
So it's a very vague question, yeah.
User experience is everything, right? That's ultimately what you want. Whatever environment you're creating, you want that user to experience that in a safe way. You don't want the user to be terrified, genuinely. So I just would say that that's your design criteria. You just want to create that environment. You want to make it as real as possible without while still making a user feel safe and in control. That I don't know if that answers your question or not.
I guess another question would be like, follow-up would be like, what was the most challenging thing to be working with someone who does just hardware stuff versus like someone who does like computer programming? Like, what do you, like, maybe it's changed since you developed Qbert, but what was the most challenging part for somebody who does like the programming of the game itself versus someone who builds the hardware? Like, you're talking about the pinball with having that phone, and you like that, but like.
So I missed a little bit of your question. What was the most challenging?
As someone who does like the computer programming part of it,
right,
versus interacting with someone who developed the hardware.
Yeah.
But like, not so much like what the design graphics, but someone like who has like, how do you choose like what type of control will do this sort of command that shows up on the screen and causes the character to do this sort of stuff. Like.
Okay, but I'm sorry. What's the question? I can't.
No, it's just like, so I deal with, it's more of like personalized, like I do computer programming and I work with people with hardware, and sometimes someone who has an idea of like what a computer algorithm or something would do versus how it interacts in the real world. And I was just interfacing between someone who just deals with computer stuff versus.
Are you talking about communicating with somebody? Like, how do you talk to somebody? Oh, okay. So there's a question there. Okay. I just, honestly, I wasn't sure what you were asking.
It's very vague, yes.
I mean, whenever I try to communicate with anybody, I just try to find a common language. Usually that common language is English. Like, I don't like to speak in acronyms. I'm an engineer. I've gone to meetings where people talk in acronyms and they don't stop to ask you if you know that acronym.
Yeah.
So I find myself constantly in meetings going, what's that? What's that? I don't care if I look stupid. If I don't know what you're talking about, I've got to find out what you're talking, like I just did. Like, I can't just pretend like I know what, like I'm not inside your head, because I don't know what you're really asking me until you. So I just try to find a common language. And if people are not speaking in a language that I understand, I ask them to rephrase the question. I ask them, can you, I might say something like, okay, well, look, I'm not an engineer, or I might say something like, I'm not an artist, can you say it in layman's terms or things like that? But yeah, communication is absolutely important. The thing, I was lucky with people like Jeff and Dave in that we just all kind of spoke the same language naturally. And when you find those people, I mean, that's really wonderful. That's could be rare, but it's wonderful when you find people who your sensibilities are alike, your way of communicating is alike, and also, of course, you have to have respect for each other. Treat each other with respect. So, I hope that answers your question.
All right, we got two more. Yes, sir. You up front.
This is a weird little question. What about Hubert has a voice? Do you have any interesting tidbits about how he sounds and his actual voice in the game? And it's kind of a peculiar voice. I don't know if you covered that earlier, but
Kind of.
Yeah, we did. We talked about the random number generation and the chip that the data is fed into and everything. Yeah, no
it's
worries,
okay.
no worries.
It's okay. You just came in late. It's like, no, it's totally fine. But yeah, I mean, it was Dave Thiel was our sound designer, and he was the guy who had this idea to just throw random numbers at this phoneme generator, and it just turned out to be perfect.
Yeah, definitely go back and listen to the recording or watch the video. We walk all the way through it. Yes, sir.
So following on the idea of voice and language, obviously the games that you've created went worldwide at this point. Do you have any particular story that sticks out in your mind about someone who maybe doesn't speak English but experienced your games and you were able to either witness that or see the joy in that from a different vantage point, other than being the person that created it, just seeing someone play it?
Well, I mean, I've watched a lot of people play it, and I've actually, since I've been doing retro gaming shows, I have had people come up to me who are clearly not native English speakers and tell me how much they love the game. And I think, that's because it goes beyond language. It's, as do so many things, sometimes magic can go, if you have a magician, they don't have to speak. They can do a magic trick for you, and it's like universal language. But yeah, I mean, I don't have a particular story, just that people have expressed to me, people from who have all sorts of native languages have expressed to me that they've loved the game, and it's fantastic.
Yeah, I think the mechanics and just the gameplay of it, it appeals. It's so simple that it appeals and transgresses a lot of that.
I would even go as far as say, I think modern games have lost some of that because there's so much to read and understand.
Yes.
Simplicity is gone.
Yeah.
Well, so many games have moved into this mode of story. And listen, when I was, back in 1982, I think I and most of my colleagues in the industry, we did kind of dream of a time where these games would be interactive stories. We wanted to move closer to movies, but we wanted to retain that interactiveness. My problem with a lot of modern games is you turn it on and you have to watch a 20-minute movie before you can start playing. That just totally floors me. It's like, why? Why would you do that? I didn't buy this game so I can sit here and watch a movie. So, the idea, and again, as far as language, I do think, you do need to communicate with the player the more complex a game is. But most games are, localized to many different languages. So people, whatever your native language is, you should have the opportunity to play it.
Yeah. All right. Any other questions? All right, we're good. Well,
Thank you. Well,
thank you.
Did you want to?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's just waving.
I was just wanted to say thank you for coming, and I will be here tomorrow and Sunday, and I have a table. I do have my memoir, which covers 14 years of being in the arcade industry. Please come on by, look through it, see if it might be something that might interest you. I'm happy to sign it. But yeah, and come back with any questions you have.
Yeah, there's no way we can cover 14 years in 60 minutes, but we tried.
But in a book.
But in a book, that's exactly right. Yeah. See, I'm working up to that. So.
There you go. Right.
No, but Warren, thank you for your time. It was great, very educational, and got some really good insight. So
Well, thank you.
really appreciate that. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Whitney.
Certainly
I appreciate it.
Yes.
Thank you all. Thank you.